Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Pieces of Meesh Podcast. This is Misha, and thank you for joining me today. So, the title of today's episode is Big Girls Do Cry and Why Suppressing Emotions Hurts Us All. Growing up, I was always told big girls don't cry. And maybe you've heard it before too. So at that time, it felt like a command to be strong. But as I've gotten older, I've realized it was more than that. It was a message that my emotions were somehow wrong. And it left a lasting impact on how I see emotions in myself and how I see my emotions now as an adult. Today, I want to talk about what happens when we tell children they're too big to cry. What does that do to them as they grow into adults? And I'll be sharing my own story of being told to stop crying when I was little, when I was a child, and how it has shaped me as an adult, the lessons that I've learned from even watching my niece navigate her emotions, and ultimately how my yoga practice finally helped me reconnect with the tears I've been holding back for years. That being said, let me take you all back to where it all started. So, if you know me, like if you really know me, friends, family, I am a crier. I am a crier. And on top of that, I am notoriously known in my family as Screaming Mimi. You heard it. Screaming Mimi. And although I'm not called Screaming Mimi anymore, people don't call me that anymore, but we can look back on home videos and I'm usually crying or yelling and someone is calling me Screaming Mimi. And it doesn't often come up, but it does come up when maybe I'm with family and another child is crying and someone has to say, "You used to cry just like that. You used to be just like that." And obviously, I have no recollection. So if I don't remember, it didn't happen. So my family, my friends, they know I'm a crier. That is not a part of me that the world sees, although I did just cry on Instagram a couple of days ago. But I don't regret that because those were tears of joy. But I want to share with you all a personal story of really the first time I remember being told that I was too big to cry. It was first grade, so I'm assuming it was like 1997. And my first grade teacher was Mrs. Payne. Maybe she was married, I don't remember. But Mrs. Payne was my first grade teacher. And if any of her relatives are listening to this, no hate at all. But Mrs. Payne was too old to be teaching at that time. I'm just going to say it. She was too old. I'm not even trying to be ageist, but I mean, she was old. So that's why she had a teacher's aide because she couldn't watch all of the kids in her class. That classroom was wild. She had a teacher's aide, and that teacher's aide is very important to this story because she helped me a lot in my transition from kindergarten to first grade. Because when I was in school, so my mom is a stay at home mom. My mom does, have a degree. She did teach, but when she began to have children, she decided to be a stay at home mom. That's a decision her and my dad made. That's the type of family they wanted to raise. That's them. It worked for them. But my mom was a stay at home mom. So I was used to spending a lot of time with my mother. And I did go to daycare when I was 3. I went to Tiger Tots. Shout out to Tiger Tots at McKeesport High School. And I went to St. John's Preschool when I was 5. So then when I was 6, it was time to start kindergarten or first grade. But the difference between the daycares, the preschools, and kindergarten is that they were all half day. And I can't remember how long, but maybe, 4 hours possibly, because I think a school day is around 7.5, 8 hours. So I was used to being away from my mom for 4 hours. That was fine. 4 hours is long enough. And then I remember starting first grade and, my mom dropped me off. We go to lunch and I'm thinking it's time to go home. We're not going home. They said we got to stay longer. What? No, I want to go home. And, I couldn't go home. So I started crying. And I remember this. I remember Mrs. Payne came up to me. We were back in class after lunch. And she said, "You need to stop crying." And I was like, still crying. And then she said, She pointed to the smallest girl in the class. Her name was Whitney. I don't know what happened to Whitney. I hope she's doing well. But Whitney was tiny. She was tiny. She pointed to the smallest girl in the class and she said, "Look, Whitney's not crying and you're bigger than Whitney. You're too big to cry." Of course, that didn't do anything but make me feel worse. So Miss Banna was the teacher's aide. I'm assuming her title was teacher's aide, but shout out to Mrs. Banna. Mrs. Banna was a teacher's aide. So she walked me down to the office so that we can call my mom and my mom can calm me down. And I went home, I'm assuming. But I don't know how long this lasted, but every day after that, I cried every day at school in first grade. And every day, Mrs. Banna would have to walk me to the office to call my mom on the phone to calm me down. Like I would just literally be on the phone with my mom crying, saying, "Mom, come get me, come get me, come get me." And of course she wouldn't come get me because I had to stay in school. But that is the first time I ever remember being told that I was too big to cry and that my size had an impact on the way I was allowed to express my emotions. And the one thing I will say about my parents, and I commend them for, I didn't get beat. I didn't get beat growing up. My brother and sister did. All of my siblings did. I didn't. And I don't know if it was because, they were probably, well, I can't even say they were old and tired by the time I was born because they were still beating my siblings while I was, growing up. But I would like to think they saw how very emotional I was and physical violence would not have it wouldn't have added anything special to that. And I think all children have big emotions. Why they didn't hit me, I do not know. But I know that I could barely tolerate life as it was as a child. So being beat on top of that probably would have sent me into a whirlwind. But so I didn't have one of those experiences like, I'll give you something to cry about. My parents weren't like that with me. But I do think they noticed my very big emotions. And what really sparked my reflection on this when I was in first grade was my niece, Khalees. So Khalees is 6 years old. I'm pretty sure she's either 6 or 7. She might be 7. She's in first grade, but she's a big girl. She is a big girl. And I mean, she looks 10. She does not look like a 6-year-old. And she was here maybe 2 weeks ago. And I looked down at her foot and I said, "Wait a minute, come over here." And I told her to put her foot next to mine. Her foot is as long as my foot. And when I talk about being a big girl, because I'm a big girl, okay, I'm not ashamed to say this because I'm thick and fine, but I'm 5'10". And the last time I went to the doctors, he said I was 247, but I did eat a bagel and drink a cup of coffee and had all my clothes on when they weighed me. So, I think it added about 10 pounds. But, I'm 5'10", almost pushing 250. I'm a big girl. So, and I wear a size 10 shoe. So when my niece came over and put her foot next to mine and they were the same length, I said, "Girl, you're 6 years old. Why do we have the same shoe size?" She's like, "I don't know." She's really cute. But I have to remember to be mindful how I speak to her and just about how her body, because I remember how it felt to have a bigger body as a child, and people will speak to me in a way that they do not speak to other children who quote unquote look like children. Because I looked bigger, I had to suppress those emotions, my 6-year-old emotions, because I looked like a 10-year-old. Seeing my niece made me think of that because I often forget she is only 6. She is only 6. And I think we expect too much out of children anyways, but it is very easy to treat her like she is older because she looks older. She's 6. And seeing her is just always that reminder of how I wanted to be treated at her age. I wanted to be seen like the other kids. And you would never think growing up bigger would be as embarrassing. Because when I talk about bigger, I'm not even talking about fat. Because I don't think anybody would have considered me a fat kid, but I was a tall kid. And although I was bigger than most girls in kindergarten, I wasn't bigger than the boys. But around second grade is when I was bigger than the boys. Like I was a big girl. And, I'm not going to get into it, all the things, but having to have a different desk than all the other kids, like, and it's just those things of always being othered that I experienced when I was little. And on top of that, being very emotional and not knowing how to process those emotions because I was told I can't, made it even worse. So as I grew up, what happens when you're told not to cry? For me, it started to be labeled as tough, strong. In high school, they would call me Big Meesh. Oh, Big Meesh, and people knew I was sensitive though in high school. Like I was big, but I wasn't tough. And thankfully, I didn't get picked on. But I do feel like if I was smaller, people probably would have picked on me because I was quiet. But people often didn't say much to me or didn't pick on me because I was bigger. So I already gave off that persona that, oh, Misha's tough. Misha probably pummel my head in when I wasn't doing any of that, But because I was bigger, I had to carry myself a certain way. I had to keep up the persona of being a tough girl, of being a big girl, of being someone you shouldn't try because I'm bigger than you. And I think another place where that big girls don't cry mentality showed up for me was in college. And I'm not going to share details. I'm not going to share names, but I never want to come off like I'm snitching or I don't have any of those intentions. I just want to share my story. But when I was in college, I participated in some activities that included physical abuse. And I participated in these activities willingly. That's on me for allowing these things to happen to my body, to my psyche. That is on me. And I take full accountability for the ways I've participated in these practices. But I can remember specifically on the first night of participating in these activities, I cried. I busted out crying and I was the only one crying. And everybody's like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Trying to make sure I wasn't, physically injured. And, nothing was wrong physically, but emotionally, I was very overwhelmed by what I was experiencing. And the only way I knew how to express that was through crying. But again, I was going through a process that told me, you are in this position. You're supposed to be this. You have to be this because you are this size. You are not supposed to be crying because you are supposed to be protecting. And that got so ingrained in me that I did not cry for years. So that was when I was 20 years old. And I didn't cry, like not a tear. I didn't know how to cry because those emotions were so suppressed that I didn't even know they existed. And from 20 years old to 25 years old, I did not cry. And I'm trying to think if I even cried when I was 25 because that is when my dad died. And I feel like I cried, but I honestly don't think I cried when my dad died. I don't. Was I sad? Was it devastating? Do I cry about it now? Have I cried about it in previous years? Yeah, but I honestly don't think I may have even cried then. And as I reflect on it, it felt like so much of my life from my experience when I was 20 to 25 felt like I was in autopilot. And what I'm learning or what I've learned as I've been sitting in therapy, in the recent years is that I was still living in my trauma. I was still living in that fight, flight, or freeze. And for me, it's freeze. I was still living in that freeze of not being able to process my emotions and being stuck in them. The turning point for me came when I started practicing yoga. And I didn't realize it at the time, but yoga became the space where I could finally feel everything that I had buried for so long. And I can remember a specific class, probably the first class, where I cried. And it was a meditation. So at the time, this was 2022, I was a studio manager at a yoga studio. And most classes were virtual, they were online, but the teachers would teach out of a studio. And the teacher was leading a meditation. So it was more so a meditation with gentle movement. So I think we were in child's pose for the majority of the meditation. And we came out of child's pose into a seated position, and she continued leading us through the meditation. And I can't remember exactly what she said, but she just said, like, let it go. Let it go. And I kid you not, y'all, I just felt a lightness. Like I felt a weight leave my body. It left. And I instantly started crying. But because, I was doing the meditation, but I was always also at work, and like I was in the same room the teacher was teaching the virtual class from. I couldn't bawl like I wanted to, but I started, a little whimper. I had a little whimper. And that was the first time I ever, 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 ever cried being led through a wellness practice like that. And at first I was a little embarrassed. I was, because I'm like, oh, I'm in here crying. I'm at work. But then it was also like, Meesha, you needed that. You needed that release. And that person leading that class made you feel safe enough to do that. So let it out, because you don't often get to be in spaces where you feel safe enough to cry. Now, at this point, would I probably cry like that again in spaces like this? I don't know, because of some of the traumas that I experienced in spaces. I'm a little reserved on whether or not I can really open up like that again. But I know I have to, in order to continue to live in my purpose and to create safe spaces where people can be vulnerable. Like my yoga practice taught me to sit with my emotions, to breathe through them, and to honor them. And it gave me permission to cry again, and to do so without shame, because I carried so much shame for crying, so much shame for being emotional. And up until recently, I regretted crying in front of some people. I regretted being that vulnerable. And I was like, Meesha, you cannot regret that. You cannot have shame for that, because you showed people who you were. And people decided to take advantage of that vulnerability. That is not your fault. It shows just how big your heart is. It shows just how safe you felt in places where you shouldn't have felt that safe. But don't regret it, because people saw you. People saw you, and they chose to believe your tears were manipulation, because they can't access their own tears. And I knew I had to let that shame, I had to let that guilt go. I'm a crier. Okay? I'm a crier. I cry. I cry. And I've wanted to cry for years. And now, I cry on Wednesdays. What is it? Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, because those are the days my mom isn't home. And my mom's an Aquarius, and I've honestly never saw my mom cry. Never. And the last time I cried in front of her, she said that ain't nothing but the devil. So, we got our own issues. We got our own issues to sort out. So, I usually cry when she is not home. But I love to cry. I do. It is such a release. It is such a release. And my yoga practice has helped me notice or have the awareness that that release comes from my hips. It does. That release comes from my hips. And that is a place where we store, and I'm saying we because I know a lot of people from teaching these hip opener classes, our hips is a place where a lot of us store that tension. And for me, crying gives me the same release that a hip opening yoga practice does. And then don't put the hip opener practice and the crying together, then I'm in shambles. So looking back, I see now that crying doesn't make me weak. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. It's a sign that we're alive. It's a sign that we're processing. And it is a sign that we are healing. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that our emotions are a gift. And they connect us to ourselves and each other. I've learned that my crying, my sensitivity is my superpower. It is. It is because it shows that I still have access to my emotions. So, for all the big girls out there, all the girls who were told, any child, boy, girl, they, them, whatever, anybody who was told that you're too old to cry, you're too big to cry, I want you to know that it is okay to cry. And I want all of us, no matter how old we are, to know that too. Big girls do cry, okay? We cry. And it's okay to let it out. It is okay to let it out. So yeah, y'all, it's actually Wednesday and it is my scheduled cry day, but my mom is home, so I'm gonna have to hold it in. But thank you so much for listening today. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, like I said, big girls do cry. And it's a beautiful thing. Your tears are beautiful. You're loved. You're protected. You're safe. Your energy is safe here. But yeah, y'all, that's it. So make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe to the Pieces of Meesh YouTube, subscribe to the Pieces of Meesh podcast, back here every week with a new podcast episode. So thank you all for tuning in, and I am out.